Lens is a protocol that allows developers to build applications using a composable and decentralized social graph. Now, what exactly does that mean? Well, when we think about a lot of the types of applications that we use today that allow people to create content, they follow a very similar pattern. When we think of things like Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, or even TikTok, they allow users to create a profile, publish content, other people to view that content, as well as to follow users and see their future content. This pattern is very, very common, but we haven't really had a way to build out these type of applications in Web3 in an easy way. So this is kind of where Lens protocol comes into play. They've deployed a code base that you can either fork or use the current implementation of that's already been deployed to build out these types of applications. One of the things that I love the most about Web3 is this idea of public data, public infrastructure, and composability. And with Lens Protocol, this offers a really great framework to build out a lot of these ideas that people have envisioned for Web3. Again, this protocol is a code base that you can either fork and deploy yourself, or you can actually take someone else's deployed code base that's already been submitted to some network and actually use that and build off of the existing data as well as the network effects there. Now, this is really great because we now have the opportunity to say, in the past when Twitter had a really great API that we could build off of and then they would change it, we know that with the immutability of smart contracts, that data will always be there and those functions will be there in the version of the contracts that were deployed in the past. So we should be able to continue building upon each other's work, which is a really great thing. Now, when we're interacting with Lens Protocol, there are a couple of ways that you can do that. They have their smart contracts that are deployed to Polygon, or you can obviously, again, maybe deploy your own, and then you can interact directly with the smart contract functions that are written there. But they've also written their own indexer that gives you a GraphQL API that you can either query or send mutations to. And then the third way that you might want to consider interacting with the protocol is using something like the Graph protocol. And there isn't an official subgraph yet for Lens, but there are a couple of community created subgraphs that are currently under development that will be soon coming to maturity. One of the ones that I recommend the most is from Protofire. They have already kind of deployed a working version and they will be continuing to update it. But there are also a couple of other great ones that are currently being built today. So in this tutorial, in this video, what I basically want to do is show you how to build out a full stack social media application, or kind of like the getting started to how you would do that by building out an end-to-end code base where we kind of build out a web application that allows a user to kind of like see all of the users that are currently part of the protocol, allows us to search for new users, allows us to kind of drill down into an individual user and see their profile information and then follow a user. So that's kind of what we're going to do today. We're going to start from scratch, building out a brand new Next.js application, adding in all those features. By the end of this video, you should have a good understanding of how Lens protocol works, how to query data from the deployed protocol using their APIs, and also how to send a transaction to the smart contract to make updates and state changes. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get started writing some code. So we'll get started by creating a new Next.js application. And I'll go ahead and open this up in my text editor. All right, so the first thing we want to do is go ahead and install some of our dependencies. So the dependencies that we want to work with are going to be So the dependencies that we're going to work with are going to be ethers, Urkel, which is going to be the GraphQL client that we work with, and then GraphQL. And you can install these using either npm, yarn, pnpm, or whatever your favorite tool is. So while those are installing, let's go to the Lens protocol docs, and we're going to click on Dev Garden. And here we're going to click on Read the Developer Docs. And what I'm going to go to is basically the let's look at a couple of things. First of all, we're going to go to lenshub.sol, and we're going to kind of like look at that. We're also going to go to the deployed contract addresses here and take a look at that in just a moment. And then finally, we want to look at the API itself. So lenshub.sol is going to give us the functions that we can call directly. So these would be the state changing functions, which would be the updates, and the view functions, which are going to be the read operations. The deployed contract addresses, we're going to need these. We're going to need just these first two, I believe. One to get the ABI, and then one to actually send the contract calls for state changes. And then the API itself, this is where we're going to basically be querying the different GraphQL queries that we want to work with. So for instance, we can do things like explore publications, explore profiles. We can do things like get an individual profile. We can create a profile. So these API calls are both for read and I would say like write operations. So a query would be a read operation in GraphQL, and a mutation would be a write operation. So what are some of the different queries that we're going to be working with? Well, one of them is going to be the get profiles query that we're going to create, and this should be under like here under get profiles. And one of the great things about this is that it actually has a lot of documentation around what this like GraphQL schema looks like, as well as what the operation itself might look like, and then what the response looks like. So all that stuff is really great. So and then even that, like we actually have the GraphQL query that we can just copy. So this is going to be kind of what we're going to be doing for when we call these different queries. We're going to come here and we're going to be able to just like copy this code and then maybe make some small modifications to it. So with that being said, let's go ahead and maybe think about what would be the first query that we want to work with. And I guess what we might want to work with is just getting like the recommended profiles. So with that, we can basically say, okay, we want to hit this API endpoint, and we want to kind of just let the API itself return some recommended popular profiles. So it basically says, this is a basic way to get popular profiles. So to do that, we can basically just copy this query. And we might not need all of this data that's being returned back. Looks like I can just click here to copy it to the clipboard. But we're going to just copy this just to make it easy. And we're going to go over to our code, and we're going to go ahead and create a file called like api.js. And here we'll go ahead and create a query called recommend profiles. And we'll just paste in the code that we copied from the API docs. Next, we'll go ahead and import from Urkel, create client. And this is what we're going to use to create our GraphQL client. Next, we want to define our API URL. And this is going to be the API URL given to us by Lens protocol. So if I go to API links, I can go ahead and copy this api.lens.dev. And then I can say export const client is equal to create client, passing in the URL as the API URL. And now we're ready to kind of test this out. So what I'm going to do next is go to index.js. And here I'm going to go ahead and delete basically all of this code here. And we're going to start from scratch. So I want to go ahead and import use states and use effect from React. And I'll go ahead and import clients and recommend profiles from API. Actually, I think this is recommend profiles. Okay, and then we want to say in use effect we'll call a function called fetch profiles that we'll go ahead and create now. All right. And I think what we basically want to do here is call this, or I would say call the API with this query. So I can say const response is equal to client.query, passing in the query here, and then saying that to promise. And just console.log that out. And then I'll actually wrap this in a try catch block. And paste that back there. All right, so now we'll go ahead and run the server and test this out. To run the server, we can run npm run dev. And we can go to localhost 3000. And open up the console. And it looks like I need to add the await keyword here. Test this out again. And there we see the response, and we have the data, and then we have the recommended profiles. So we have our data coming back. So the next thing we want to do is kind of store this in our state so we can render it in our UI. So we can say const profiles, set profiles is equal to use state. And then we can say set profiles using response.data dot recommend profiles. I think that's it. So what we should be able to do now is map over this data and essentially go ahead and display it in the UI. So what we could, I guess we can go ahead and do that, but what we could also do is maybe query like one publication for each users. So if we go to something like Linster, we see that when this loads, we have a bunch of users, but we also see like one post from each of them. So we could consider doing that. But for now, let's worry about that later. So what I basically wanted to do now is map over all these profiles and then provide a way to kind of like drill down into each individual profile and look at them individually. So to provide that link, let's go ahead and import link from next/link. And we can then say profiles.map. And we can actually probably wrap this in a link. And then wrap this in an anchor. And then for the href, we want to say basically something like /profile/ I think this is going to be something like profile.id. So let's take a look at this data that came back here. Yeah, so we have the profile ID. We could also link to something like the profile handle or something like that. So for now, let's just link to the ID, and then we can use that ID to kind of fetch their information. So let's look at the other data that's coming back. So we have a bio, we have a cover picture, we have a picture, and we have the handle. So I think it might be cool to show the handle in the bio. So let's start off by saying profile.handle, and then with the paragraph tag we can say profile.bio. And let's go ahead and try that out. And it looks like we're getting some error. So let me just console.log profiles. Let's take a look at that response one more time. Make sure that we're saving the right data. Response.data.recommended profiles. So maybe I might be saying recommend profiles as opposed to recommended profiles. So let's try that one more time. And there we go. We have our data coming back. So if I click on one of these, nothing's going to happen yet because we haven't set up that link yet. But let's go ahead and maybe do one more thing and show the image. So I can go ahead and import image from next/image. And I can say something like profile.picture. And if they have a picture, we'll show something. And if they don't, we'll show something else. So if they have a profile picture, we'll show an image. And we need to set a source. We need to set a width. And we need to set a height. And the source is going to be the profile.picture. .original.url. And if they don't have a picture, we can just show like a div. And I'll just do some basic ugly inline styling here, and I'll say like width is so we'll just show like an empty box or something like that. All right, so if I save that and we refresh, oh yeah, so it looks like we need to do some configuration for Next.js to recognize IPFS as this image source. So to do that, we can go to our next.config, and here we can go ahead and set images. Now, if you didn't use next image, this would work fine if you were just using a regular image tag. So here we want to go ahead and put domains, and we want to set the domains as ipfs.infura.io, and then we need to restart our server. So I'm going to go ahead and close that and restart it. See what happens here. All right, boom. We have our stuff happening. So for some weird reason, this doesn't have the width. So I must have done something wrong there. So let's check that out. Of course, I spelled width wrong. All right, there we go. And maybe we can add a little bit better, slightly better styling by going to something like app.js, and then maybe just providing some like really basic padding or something like that. right, so we have our data coming back from Lens, and now we want to essentially kind of like click on one of these profiles and drill down into them and maybe follow them. So to do that, I can go to Pages, create a new folder called Profile. Within that, create a new file called id.js. And here we're going to say export function profile. And we want to go ahead and import use router from from next/router. And then here we can say const router is equal to use router. And then here we can say we essentially need to get the ID for the user. So we can do something like const ID is equal to router.query. And then here we can show their ID. And this will be the most basic kind of like UI we can start off with, but at least it should work. So if I refresh and I click on this user, we need to change something else. I need to make this the default export. All right, so we're getting the user ID off of the URL here. So what we now need to do is to kind of call a function to get the information based on that user ID. So the query that we want to essentially use is get profiles. So if I go to API and I look for under profile, I should see a function called get profile. Or let's see here, they have get default profile. They have get profiles. So let's do get profiles, and all we need to pass in is essentially like something like that with just maybe a single like array with a single item. So we'll go ahead and copy that query and let's see here. I think we can use this one. Okay, yeah, you can pass in the handle as well. Bunch of different queries that you can call. So I think what we're going to do is call get profiles by ID. So I'll copy this. And I will go to our API here. And I'll create a function or create a variable called get profile or get profiles. And by pasting this in as is, we actually have to make some updates because right now we're kind of hard coding a profile ID when in reality we need to pass this in as a variable. So what we can do is say like $ID is equal to profile ID. And this profile ID is actually defined here in the query interface or somewhere here. Yeah, right there. So we have the profile ID is kind of like part of the request. So profile IDs is going to be an array of profile ID. So instead of like saying profile IDs, we can just say $ID because we're only passing in a single ID. And then using that query, we should be able to get that profile. And like we only need really one profile, so the limit doesn't really need to be 10. It can just be 1, I guess. All right, so to use that, we can go back to id.js. And we're going to go ahead and import the client as well as get profiles from API. And I want to make sure I exported that. Okay, I did. And then we also want to import use state, and use effect from React. All right, and then in use effect, we can have this trigger on when the ID is made available or when it updates. Because like right when this loads, I don't believe it'll be available. And we want to call this function called fetch profile when the ID is available. And we might even say like if ID. Okay, cool. So with that, we can do another try catch block. And here we can say const response is equal to awaits client.query. And we can pass in get profiles. But the only difference here is that we actually need to pass in a variable. So for the second one, for the second argument, we can pass in an object for an ID, and we can say .toPromise. And that ID, again, it's coming off of the route. So next I want to go ahead and, I guess, log this out. And let's go ahead and test this out. So response.data.profile.items. And there we go. We have that information coming. So we have things like the bio, we have the handle, we have their picture, we have their stats. So let's display some of this. So instead of just showing the div with the ID, let's go ahead and import image. And here we want to say something like profile.image. I'm sorry, profile.picture.original. We'll say profile.picture. And then if they don't have one, we want to show something else. But where is that profile coming from? I guess we need to go ahead and create some state. So I'm going to say const profile set profile is equal to use state. And then what we can do here is say set profile, passing in the response dot data dot get profiles dot items, the 0th item in the array. I believe that's what that looks like. Response dot data dot profiles, actually. Profiles.items. Okay. So if there is a picture, we'll show the image. We'll set a width and a height. All right, so we're going to show the picture. The handle, the bio, I believe it is, and we can look and see total followers. It was profile.stats. dot total followers. We can say following. Instead of saying total, we can just say followers. Total following. I'm sorry. Yeah, total following. All right, so let's try that again. And I guess we want to also do, I'm not sure if this is where the error is coming from. We're going to say if profile return null. This way we have time to kind of fetch that information. And there we go. We see that we have the username, their details, their follower count, and how many people they're following. And then finally, what we want to do also is get their publications. So there is a query for publications here. And what we want to do is basically get the publications for a user. And I think that this is the query that we want to work with. So it's just query publications. So we can just copy this. This is quite a big query. And in reality, you actually don't need all of this code because of the fact that we're just using GraphQL. And with GraphQL, you can return only the data that you want to use. So this is definitely a bit overkill. I would recommend trimming some of this off. In fact, I will be linking to a more polished repo that kind of like does this for you. But for now, let's go ahead and use this code just to kind of get us started. So if I go to api.js, I can say export const get publications, and I'll go ahead and paste this in. And what I need to do, though, again, is make sure that I'm only requesting for the profile ID that I want to query for. So I need to pass in an argument here that's like ID, profile ID. And then for the profile ID, I can use that variable ID. And then for the publication types, we don't really need like all of these. Maybe we'll just do posts. And for the limit, we can hard code that, or we could also pass it in as a variable, like using the $ like limit, which is a scalar, I believe. So, but for now, let's not worry about that. Let's just say, okay, we want to get 20 publications max for each person. So what I can now do here is in ID.js, I can go ahead and import get publications. And I can also create a variable called publications, I guess. Well, let's just call that pubs, set pubs, equal use state. We'll set that to like an array. And then what we can now do is go ahead and call client.query, passing in get publications, and I need to make sure that I import that. Yeah, I did. Okay. And then here we need to pass in actually a little bit different of a query because of the way that this is structured. We need to pass in a request object. So I need to say like request, and then the ID is going to be, let's see here, the profile ID, which should just be the ID. And then here I want to say .toPromise. And now I want to go ahead and console.log publication data. And let's see if that's coming back. Publication data.data. Let's try that again. Looks like the ID is not being recognized for some reason. Did I spell this wrong, or did I just... Yeah, I did. That doesn't really matter, but still I want to fix it. going to console.log the ID, make sure that's coming through. So get publications, passing in. Let me see something. Maybe I don't need that request variable. Let me just delete that additional request variable and just try this maybe. Okay, cool, there it goes. All right, so now we have the publication data coming back. So what I can do now is say pubs.map. And we can just say pub dot metadata dot content. And then maybe we'll find a way to kind of like do some basic styling. All right, so let's go ahead and refresh that, see if their publications come through. Maybe I didn't call set publications actually. So next we need to do set pubs, and we're going to pass in publication data dot data.publications.items. All right, there we go. So now we're kind of querying their publications. And the last thing we might want to do is follow them. So to follow them, we need to call a contract call, which we haven't really done yet. And we need to get, first of all, the address for the contract, which is, it says right here, this is the one for interactions. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that address. And I'm going to go here, and I'm going to say const address is equal to this. Next, I want to go ahead and get the ABI. So to get the ABI, I can click on the implementation here. And I can go to contract. And I can scroll all the way down here. And it might be available somewhere else too. I don't know. But for now, this is where it's at. So I'm going to copy that ABI. And I'm going to go here and make a new file called abi.json. Paste it in. Format it. And there we go. We have our ABI. So I can go ahead now and import ABI from ABI. So in addition to that, we do need to wait to let the user connect their wallet before we can kind of like actually ask them to sign a transaction. So we'll just have a connect function. And here we can say so I can say const accounts is equal to window.ethereum.request. And I don't even think we need to kind of get the return from that, but this will just make sure that we're connected. So I might then create a button that says like sign in. And this isn't really a sign in, this is more like a connect. So let's call it connect. And we'll go ahead and refresh. And first I want to make sure I'm not already connected from a previous application. Looks like I am, so I'm going to go ahead and disconnect. So I'm going to click connect. And connect. So now that we're connected, we want to have a function that allows us to go ahead and sign a transaction and make that call. So I'm going to have a function called follow user. And for us to use this, we want to go ahead and import ethers from ethers. And we're going to need this ABI and this address as well. So here I can say const provider is equal to new ethers dot provider Ethereum. And then with this provider, I can say const signer is equal to provider dot get signer. And then we can say const contract is equal to new ethers dot contract. And then we're going to pass in the first argument is going to be the address. The next, next is going to be the ABI, and then the last is going to be the signer. And then finally, we can do like a try catch block. And here we're going to go ahead and say const transaction is, and this is where we're going to call contract.follow. And follow is one of the methods that you'll see documented here under the state changing functions. So follow is right here. And I'm going to talk about gasless transactions at the end of this as well. But for now, let's just go ahead and call the contract method directly. So I'm going to say contract.follow. And then here we need to pass in the first argument is going to be the ID that we'd like to follow. And then the second argument is actually interesting because it allows you to pass in some additional data. And I don't really know what this arbitrator data is for, to be honest. So it says you can pass data to the being followed follow module. So I don't really know the exact use case for that. But for now, I'm just going to pass in basically nothing. And if this is successful, we can kind of like await transaction.wait. And then we should be able to say console.log followed user successfully. All right, so so let's go ahead and give this a shot because we now need to create a button for following the user. So I might say put a button right here or something. And let's go ahead and give this a shot. So I'm going to open back up my console. And I'm already connected. So now I should be able to click follow user. And it looks like the ABI was typed in wrong here. Let's try that again. Follow user. Looks like this needs to be await. So let's try that one more time, even though it looks like it's working. I need to make sure that I use the async version of that. All right, so now we're going to basically be paying for this transaction, 0.006 Matic. And we're going to wait a couple of seconds and see if this works. All right, now we see that we've logged out followed user successfully. And if we want to test out to see if we are currently following someone, there's actually an API for that. There's APIs for quite a few things that you might find useful. So does follow would basically be a good way for you to kind of implement that functionality on this page where we can kind of like show a follow button if we are not following someone, and vice versa. So like you could call this does follow query and get that information. Now, what we've used here for this mutation is an actual contract call. There are also gasless transactions that are enabled via Lens protocol. Now, right now, you have to be whitelisted to kind of do that. And I believe in the future, they're going to kind of open that up for everyone. Now, to do gasless transactions, you have to implement authentication. I haven't gone into authentication, but I'm going to link to another project. So I'm going to link to two projects. One is going to be this code base. The other is going to be a more in-depth, more styled code base that kind of is a good starter kit for working with Lens protocol that implements a lot more features like search as well as authentication. So if you want to kind of understand how authentication works, definitely check out the Lens protocol starter that I'm also going to link here. So what we've done is just in a fairly short amount of time, have implemented a fairly end-to-end getting started solution for building out a publication platform / maybe a social media type of platform where you can connect with people, you can find people. The next features you might consider implementing are like publishing posts and things like that. So I hope you learned something, and if you enjoyed this, definitely check out some of my other videos, subscribe and share this content, and keep an eye out for some of my next videos. Thank you.